of California, Irvine. It's a pleasure to be here reporting from Glasgow, UK. And we've been experiencing a very emotional, very exciting climate change conference where activists, policymakers, and world leaders are coming together to talk about how can we move forward with climate action. But here today, we're specifically talking about how can we move forward with climate action that integrates environmental justice and public health equity principles into our climate action policies. We'll be hearing from 3 innovative lawmakers from California on their perspectives of environmental justice or climate justice in California's world-renowned climate change programs. And it's particularly to have the California perspective because we're at the front lines of climate impacts and injustice. California, for example, has been experiencing a major climate change crisis along with historic racial unrest. In the last year, millions of people have been impacted by multiple disasters, wildfires, blackouts, heat waves, drought, hazardous air quality, and of course, the ever-present COVID-19 pandemic. These are all major life events. These compounding of climate-induced disasters have cascading health, social, environmental, and economic impacts. And due to existing structural inequality, these impacts are disproportionately affecting low-income people of color. So in essence, climate events are not isolated disasters. They compound with other hazards and comorbidities, or what they call in the field of public health, a syndemic. So to address the climate emergency, many of you all over the world have heard that how activists and policymakers at the federal level have proposed the Green New Deal, which many associate it as a radical proposal to decarbonize our economy and address poverty and inequality. However, for the last 2 decades, low-income communities of color have also pushed state and local governments to experiment with reducing greenhouse gas emissions and approaches that also address inequality and public health. These efforts in climate experimentation have been contentious and are often met with significant resistance. While I'm supportive of the Green New Deal, I'm here to say that there's nothing new about the Green New Deal. Climate change experiments in places like the state of California since 2004 have been all-out street fights. Environmental justice activists are often pitted against traditional environmentalists who often favor the least costly mitigation solutions, which do not necessarily maximize equity and public health outcomes in low-income communities of color. So these conflicts over climate change are cultural at their core. They illustrate that although the science of climate change is clear, policy decisions about how to respond to its effects remain contentious. Even when such decisions claim to be guided by objective knowledge, they are often implemented through political institutions and relationships and all the competing interests and racial struggles that this may imply. So if we look closely at the example of California, it reveals this contingent nature of climate change policy. The assumptions, social, political, and cultural attitudes that often create conflict between community understandings of local environmental conditions and the prevailing global top-down conceptualization of climate change. So in California, these tensions between different approaches to addressing climate change are often centered on the politics of scale, economics, class, and race. And these differences in worldviews, if unacknowledged, can lead to the breakdown of trust even among groups that are nominally working towards the same goal, reducing the harm that climate change would do to human societies and our planet. So again, for insight into national level conflicts or even global conflicts between groups working on climate change solutions, one should look to the nearly 2-decade California experiment of incorporating environmental justice and health equity principles into climate change policies. And to give you a little bit example of how environmental justice activists conceptualize climate change in California, they see that the main threat of climate change is the disproportionate harm that it causes their bodies and the health of their communities. For them, climate change is not just about global greenhouse gas models, rather it is also about the opposing worldviews to which we see policy and science. So finally, the case of California, moreover, is particularly a productive case to examine how environmental justice and climate change policy unfold and the conflicts that unfold with it. As the world's 5th largest economy and the only U.S. state to implement a comprehensive program of regulatory and market-based mechanisms to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, California has consistently been at the forefront of broader national and global environmental experimentation. The state's cap-and-trade system program, a central market-based mechanism for ensuring carbon emission reductions, is the third largest in the world after the European Union and China. This program has been especially contentious in debates within California. Supporters emphasize its global reach and cost-effectiveness, and detractors criticize its inequitable effects on specific local communities and demographic groups. California's prominence in climate change policy again makes it an ideal place to investigate these dynamics of such disputes and their roots in differing climate change worldviews. So now I'm going to pass it over to our esteemed panel of policymakers who will talk on the ground directly about the legislative triumphs and tensions that often occur in California's climate change. First, we'll be hearing from Assemblymember Eduardo Garcia, who represents California's 56th Assembly District, which includes Coachella, the Salton Sea, and Riverside and Imperial counties. He is currently the chair of the Assembly Water, Parks, and Wildlife Committee. He oversees the state's most pressing environmental issues, such as extreme droughts, and helps oversight in billions of ecosystems and environment enhancement programs. He also sits on the globally influential and powerful regulatory board, the California Air Resources Board. He has been a strong leader for implementing environmental justice and public health into the state's climate change policies. So, Assembly Member.
Thank you, Dr. Mendez, and thank you, the University of California, Riverside, for hosting this press conference. As was mentioned, my name is Eduardo Garcia. I represent the communities of Eastern Riverside County, the Coachella Valley, and the areas of Imperial County that border with the Mexican Baja California state. I couldn't agree more with the context that's been set by Dr. Mendez, and I come to think about the opening remarks of Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, to start the conference off and really put us all on the spot and talk about what are we doing to put our money where our mouth is when it comes to bringing along everyone globally. And when we talk about environmental justice issues, I think that's exactly at the front and center of our conversation in California, ensuring that those communities that have disproportionately been impacted by pollution, and the pollution that we're talking about that implicate, public health outcomes, is the issue of air quality, clean water, as well as tying into the issue of economic justice throughout the areas of the state of California. We have a unique opportunity currently as we begin updating our policies, our regulatory frameworks for our carbon mechanisms in the state of California to truly put forward front and center the environmental justice issues that have been hitting our communities significantly hard. And I think that there's a strong correlation between the public health outcomes and implications of this pandemic, certain communities in California and around the world that demonstrate exactly the lack of investment in these parts of the world, or for that matter, in communities that happen to be communities of color, predominantly in California. We have an amazing group of legislators today in the California State Capitol that are focused specifically on these issues. And so I'm very proud to be able to be joined by my colleagues. And thank you again, Dr. Mendez, for the invitation to be part of today's press conference.
Thank you. Next up, we have Assemblymember Luz Rivas, who represents Assembly District 39, which includes the city of Los Angeles region of the Northeast San Fernando Valley. I'm proud to say that she represents my hometown and represents my parents who still live in the district. She currently is the chair of the Assembly Natural Resources Committee, which has primary jurisdiction on air quality, climate change, and renewable energy. Her legislative efforts have focused on uplifting and empowering low-income communities of color. And she is also a proud graduate at MIT and fellow alum. So go Beavers. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mendez, and thank you to the University of California for setting up this press conference. I'm very proud to be here. I'm joining my colleagues in the legislature that have been champions for our low-income communities that right now are suffering the effects of climate change and are not primarily responsible for them. I think a lot of the message we hear in the media has been everyone can do something to reduce their carbon footprint, which I believe is true, but in some of our most vulnerable communities, we can all be doing that, but we still are going to be suffering from these effects. In our Natural Resources Committee, which I am the chair of, we have lots of policy proposals that come through this committee that have focused on adapting to climate change. For example, preparing for a longer and more intense wildfire season, which unfortunately in California has become an annual event. And not just preventing these wildfires is our focus, but also the public health effects that the smoke is causing in, statewide and unfortunately in other states. We've had colleagues that have risen to the challenge of sea level rise, which is a big problem in California. Protecting air quality, protecting our farms and food supply from climate impacts. But one of the things that I have been focused on as the committee chair has been on what are we doing to prepare our public health plans to account for these climate effects. And this year I focused on extreme heat. A lot of our urban areas, like I'm from Los Angeles, I'm from an area in Los Angeles where it gets to 120 degrees in the summer, Fahrenheit. Lots of vulnerable, older residents that don't have air conditioning and have nowhere to go. This extreme heat is a silent killer. Every year, hundreds or thousands of people are dying, and we don't know that, because we don't collect the data that we should be in our state. And so this year I was able to secure $150 million in the state budget for extreme heat to allow local governments to apply for these funds to come up with projects to mitigate extreme heat, such as planting more trees, implementing cool roofs, and other innovative technologies that are out there that will help cool our communities, both urban and rural statewide. And so I'm very proud to be here and excited to be part of this conversation on how we are including justice in climate change in California.
Thank you. And finally, we have Assemblymember Bryan, who represents Assembly District 54, which includes Baldwin Hills, South Los Angeles, and Inglewood. He was recently sworn into the State Assembly in May 2021. Prior to elected office, he was the founding director of the University of California, Los Angeles' Black Policy Project, a think tank dedicated to advancing racial equity through rigorous policy analysis and data. We look forward to learning more about how the Assembly member is going to be using a racial equity lens in his legislative priorities, particularly around climate change. So thank you for your leadership and for being here today.
Well, Professor, I'm glad to be here, especially at a UC-hosted event. UCLA is now in my district, so to have run a think tank there and now represented in the legislature is a powerful feeling. I represent the largest urban oil field in the United States, the Inglewood oil field. And coming here to Glasgow and talking about the global issues, one thing has risen up to be incredibly apparent to me. It's the same Black, brown, poor, and indigenous communities in my district that are most vulnerable globally. In the global south, around the world, we find that those who are in the closest proximity to environmental hazards are those who have the least connection to our civic institutions that promote opportunity and well-being, and the deepest connection to our systems of harm and subjugation. In my district, if you live within a mile of the oil wells, you are more likely to suffer from asthma rates, higher asthma rates. You're more likely to have heart disease at a younger age. You have higher morbidity rates and a lower life expectancy. Again, you're also more likely to be Black, brown, poor, and indigenous. It's not enough to think about environmental justice just as a public health crisis. It's an education crisis. It's a criminal legal crisis. It's a housing justice crisis. I'll explain why. The kids that have the higher asthma rates also have the lowest attendance rates in their schools. It's the same homes that are in proximity to our environmental hazards that are in the closer proximity to underfunded schools. Food deserts. Higher rent share burdens, lower economic mobility opportunities, higher unemployment rates. All of these things compound in a constellation of failures. So here in the California State Legislature, we have to think about these through an intersectional policy lens. And I'm proud to be up here with my colleagues who are doing that. Luz Rivas, for example, she and I co-authored a bill to give youth a voice in California policymaking, the Youth Empowerment Act. My colleague, Senator Henry Stern, and I co-authored a bill to increase accountability and transparency to make sure that those who live within a mile of an oil well can report negative public health outcomes that they're experiencing back to the state and have those reports calculated and quantified and presented to us in the legislature so that we can legislate based on data that's happening real time in our communities. Now, there's a lot of work to be done, but this year I'm proud to say California invested over $13 billion in our climate action plans, from $800 billion to address extreme heat to $100 million for climate resiliency centers. So there's a lot of promise, but I will also say California also invested $13 billion in mass incarceration in our systems of punishment at the state level. And so there's a lot of work to think about systems of harm and opportunity, systems of well-being, environmental justice, and systems of harm and subjugation that exacerbate the root conditions of these problems.
Great. Thank you so much. As you can see, California is definitely leading not only on climate action, ensuring that we have very effective mitigation and adaptation programs, but we're also leading on environmental justice and public health issues, particularly having a people-centered and equity approach to our programs and policies around climate action. So with that, we'll open it up for questions from any reporters or media that may be out there. Yeah, up front.
Tsumasato Kimura, Japanese freelance journalist. And I think carbon industry produce a lot of jobs in the past, and so many got enough wage. But nowadays wage is going down. And how do you make and no carbon economy can produce equality society, and I think it's a little bit difficult.
I'll take first part of your question, and to begin with, in California, the wages are going up. In January, we'll see an additional minimum wage increase, and at the same time, it's important to highlight that the climate policies of the state of California have amounted to over 500,000 jobs within the sectors of clean technology, the development of renewable energies, and we anticipate those numbers to continue to increase. We also are focused on a robust workforce training strategy that will allow us to transition, which all would agree we would like to see the transition happen sooner, faster. But that is some information, data that perhaps could address some of the questions that you just posed.
Yeah, can I? No, in California, we talk about a just transition, right? Meaning current, like you said, carbon economy jobs pay very well, right? Like people that work at oil refineries, it's a very high-paying job, and they're highly skilled. And we think about what are we going to do to transition them, but in a way that they're not making a lot less money, right? And that is a challenge as a legislature that we are dealing with. We're working closely, or we would like to, with our public sector unions and our construction and building trades, because they are fighting to keep those jobs. And that becomes a barrier on transitioning to a green economy, right? Because what's going to happen to that workforce? But I think we are making, some, improvements in getting there, but it definitely is a challenge for us.
Yeah, and the last thing I will add to that is just that we're making the investments in innovation, right? There's this phrase, nothing about us without us, and that includes the labor force that's working in the oil refineries and in the oil wells right now. That same labor force oftentimes comes from those same Black, brown, poor, and indigenous communities, right? And so there's no reason that environmental justice and economic justice have to come head to head. In California, we believe working in collaboration and in coordination with a coalition of partners across all sectors to get things done. And so I'm proud of the work we've done this far. We've got a lot to do in terms of what Assemblymember Rivas has said, in terms of that just transition that's truly right. We need a one-to-one job trade-off for every job in the fossil fuel industry and every job in the green economy, and we need pay equity amongst those jobs. And I think working with our labor partners is going to get us there.
My name is Sven Rudolph, Kyoto University in Japan. I have been working on cap and trade schemes and climate justice and environmental justice for some years. And of course, California is one of the most progressive, probably cap and trade schemes in the world. I would like to hear your opinion on like what you see, how far can this use of carbon pricing revenues be with respect to solving the problems of economic, social injustice, environmental injustice, and particularly because I know that in California, like a big part of the environmental justice movement has been very skeptical towards cap and trade schemes. So what would be your view on that? Thank you very much.
I'll start the responses, and the first thing is I'd like to highlight, $10 billion of investments in this last budget in California going towards investing in communities that want to see the benefits of this program or system that we've adopted. For us, that is front and center of the discussion, why we engage in this environmental and environmental justice arena of policymaking is because we want to see those investments come back to the communities that need it the most. It's equity, the word that we utilize when we're talking about a distribution of those revenues coming from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund to assist in building the housing that we need, in transitioning to a cleaner transportation system, to supporting farm workers to ensure that they also have good housing that is energy efficient for the purposes of not just saving money on energy, but also contributing to the emission reduction goals and objectives of the state. And so for us, it's extremely important to be intentional with those dollars and investing them in the places that historically have not seen those dollars coming back. And I believe that the environmental justice community and organizations that we work with in California are aligned with that vision and that mission of making sure that those dollars make their way back to those communities.
Other questions? Okay, while we're waiting for a couple of questions, I can moderate a discussion. In the work as you're developing policies, often there's that tension I mentioned earlier between cost efficiency and equity, and building support not only within the legislature itself, but in communities. How have you made climate change real to your local communities when you go talk to the community worker or farm worker or public health advocate in your district? How do you make climate change real and important to them?
I think we've had some of the hottest months in years on record. Seems like year after year. The drought conditions are incredibly real in California, as I know they are in other places around the world. In my district, we had an oil spill back in April that made it incredibly real for folks who live nearby. I think tying our environmental justice efforts in with the other social injustices and inequities that our communities are feeling is how you bring that full circle. All of these issues, again, they touch on each other. And I think when you explain that to people in real time, that they find their connection point to environmental justice work, and then we start talking solutions. And cost effective is really the job of the legislator often. And I think the role of community is to always push us to do more. Harm reduction is not always enough. Sometimes we need to just end a problem. And I think that's the critical moment that we face right now in California. That's the critical moment we face right now at COP26 here in Glasgow. Are we going to push for harm reduction or a step further, or are we going to push as far as we need to go to solve some of these problems? But I'm incredibly optimistic in California. The leadership of Governor Gavin Newsom, the leadership of Speaker Rendon, Pro Tem Tony Atkins, and others give me a lot of hope and purpose here in the legislature.
Well, the communities that I represent in Los Angeles are already facing climate crises. And sometimes what I do, I just connect those extreme weather events or the wildfires so that they can understand that this is what we mean by a climate crisis, and just making those connections to something that they're experiencing day to day. Like one of the communities in my district, Pacoima, it is one of the hottest communities in all of Los Angeles County. And it's where I grew up, right? So I know so many families, my family lives there. And so they are facing these, these effects, unfortunately, of climate change every day. And so I think in recent years, we've had a group of community leaders that have really risen to this challenge and to inform our community and to do something about it and not wait for the government to do something about it. And so I think it's great because now we have members of the community that are coming to people like me and other elected officials and saying, we want something done in our community, not just on the coast or near the ocean, which is typically associated with climate change, right? And so very excited that that is happening and that I'm in the state legislature at this time.
I was fortunate enough to attend the conference in Paris, France, and one of the things that I was real big on was making a statement about that the issue of climate and environmental justice is not so much about saving polar bears, but about people. And the fact is that it's about people's public health and well-being, far greater of a priority than the argument about polar bears. And I caught some heat for that, but nevertheless, I think I brought attention to the issue at hand, and that was that when you have communities that have children where 7 of 10 have respiratory problems, it is about the public health of people first and not the polar bears. And the fact of the matter is that when we center our policies around